Mary had always been a woman of strong character, marked by humility and resilience. Since her youth, her life had been full of challenges. She raised her son, John, alone, facing difficulties, but always with love and dedication. Now that John had grown into a successful businessman, Mary saw him as her greatest pride. He had succeeded in life, but he was about to take an important step: marriage. John had met Emily at a business event, and Emily, beautiful and charismatic, seemed perfect at first sight. But something about her behavior bothered Mary. Each time she got to know her better, Mary noticed nuances of arrogance and superficiality that worried her. She knew she couldn't tell John to give up on the marriage without concrete proof that Emily wouldn't make a good wife. John had always been very independent, and any direct interference could drive him away. Alone in her small house, Mary spent hours thinking about what she should do. She didn't want to interfere directly in her son's life, but she couldn't ignore her intuition either. She sensed that something was wrong. One evening, while preparing dinner, her mind began to formulate a daring plan. What if I went to work for Emily without her knowing who I really am? Mary knew it was risky, but it would allow her to observe Emily closely to see how she treated the people around her, especially those in positions of service. The way someone treats others, Mary thought, reveals a lot about their character. That's it, she muttered to herself as she stirred the pot. I'll find out who Emily really is. The next morning, Mary decided to tell John that she was interested in going back to work. He was surprised. Mom, you don't have to work anymore. I can look after you. John said, a little worried. I know, son, and I'm very grateful for everything you do for me. But I feel I need to keep active, to occupy myself with something. She replied, trying to sound casual, without revealing her true intentions. John agreed, albeit begrudgingly, to the idea of Mary looking for something to do. It was then that Mary asked him not to mention it to Emily. I don't want her to feel that she has to help me find a job, she explained. John found the request a little strange, but he trusted his mother's wisdom and decided to respect it. Over the next few days, Mary contacted an employment agency that offered domestic services to wealthy families. Before long, she had an interview at Emily's house. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. On the day of the interview, Mary dressed simply, trying to hide any hint of her connection to John. When she arrived at the door of Emily's mansion, she was greeted by an arrogant young woman who clearly underestimated her appearance. Are you the new maid? Emily asked dismissively, without even looking Mary in the eye. Yes, I am, Mary replied humbly, controlling her nervousness. This was her first test, and she needed to go unnoticed. Emily led her around the house, showing her the rooms and explaining her expectations. I like things done my way, and I'm very demanding, Emily warned, while Mary listened in silence. At the end of the interview, Emily, without even checking Mary's references, offered her the job. It was the beginning of a challenging but necessary phase. Mary knew that in order to understand Emily, she would have to observe her habits and, above all, how she treated those she considered inferior. The journey was just beginning, and Mary would have to hide her true identity until the time was right. That evening, on her way home, Mary looked in the mirror and reflected on what she was about to do. She had never lied to John before, but she believed that this was a necessary exception. She was doing it for his sake, to protect him from a possible trap. He'll understand, she whispered to herself, trying to find solace in her words. In the days that followed, Mary took up her new duties at Emily's house. Although she was no longer young, she was still agile and meticulous in her work. Emily, for her part, didn't seem to notice anything suspicious. In fact, she didn't even seem to care who Mary really was. From day one, she treated her with coldness and superiority. Make sure everything is perfect for dinner tonight. I can't risk having you ruin it, Emily ordered one day, without even looking at Mary. Of course, ma'am, Mary replied calmly, keeping the emotional impact of her words to herself. Every day was a test of patience and emotional endurance for Mary. As much as she felt anger at the way she was treated, she knew she had to wait. The right moment would come. Little by little, Emily's coldness turned into open contempt. She never missed an opportunity to humiliate Mary. whether in front of friends or when they were alone. "People like you should be grateful to work for people like me," Emily once said while Mary was setting the table. "Yes, ma'am," Mary replied, keeping her tone neutral, but feeling the weight of the situation in her heart. Every offensive comment was another nail in the coffin of Emily's future with John. Despite everything, Mary stood her ground. Her only concern was John. When he asked how work was going, she always replied with a calm smile, without ever mentioning the abuse she was suffering. "It's all right, darling. I'm adjusting," she would say, without him suspecting a thing. Time passed, and Mary continued to watch Emily carefully. Every attitude, every arrogant word was stored in her memory. Mary knew that the time would soon come to reveal the truth, and when it did, there would be no turning back. The decision to test Emily, although difficult, was proving to be the right one. With each passing day, it became clearer to Mary that Emily didn't deserve John's love and respect. As the weeks passed, Mary began to mentally prepare herself for the big confrontation that would inevitably take place. She knew that the revelation would come at the right time, and when it did, everyone, especially Emily, would see who she really was and what was at stake. "I'm doing this for my son's future," Mary repeated to herself, increasingly convinced that she had made the right decision. Mary was nervous the day she arrived at Emily's house for the first time as a maid. It wasn't the usual nervousness of someone starting a new job, but the weight of her secret mission. She knew that the young woman had no idea of her true identity, and this gave her an advantage, but it also made the situation more delicate. She needed to keep calm and make sure that her plan remained hidden. When she arrived, Mary was greeted by a doorman who seemed suspicious of her plain appearance, but after confirming her identity, let her in. Emily's house was huge and luxurious, with perfectly trimmed gardens and an imposing entrance. Mary knew that Emily and John lived in completely different worlds, and perhaps this was the biggest obstacle in their relationship. When she knocked on the door, Emily opened it. Mary's first impression was that the young woman was perfectly groomed, with impeccable makeup and elegant clothes, contrasting with the simplicity of the new maid. Emily looked Mary up and down, without hiding her contempt. "You must be the new maid." The tone of her voice was dry, almost impersonal, as if she were talking to someone of little importance. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Mary," she replied, keeping her composure and trying not to show her nervousness. Emily let out an impatient sigh. "Very well. Come in. I'll show you around." Mary entered, looking at every detail. The decor was luxurious, but lacked personality, as if everything there had been chosen to impress others, rather than to reflect who lived in the house. Emily walked ahead with hurried steps, as if she were impatient to finish the presentation. "Here are the main areas of the house where you'll be working," said Emily, pointing to the living room and kitchen. "I expect you to keep everything in order at all times. I don't tolerate mess." Mary nodded. "Understood, ma'am. Rest assured, I'm very careful." Emily gave her a cold look. "You'd better be. John likes things perfect, and I don't want to have to deal with complaints." At the mention of John, Mary felt a pang in her chest. She knew that her son was a fair and good man, but at that moment, it seemed that Emily was using him as a threat. It bothered her, but she kept her cool. After all, she was there to test her daughter-in-law, not to confront her. Emily then took her to the bedrooms, where she showed her the guest room, which would be where Mary would sleep if she needed to stay overnight. The room was small, with no windows, a clear demonstration that Emily had no regard for the comfort of her employees. "I hope this room is up to it," said Emily with a slight smile that bordered on sarcasm. "It's fine, ma'am," replied Mary, trying hard to remain humble. After the brief presentation of the house, Emily began to dictate her rules. "I like things done in a specific way, so pay attention. Cleaning must be done every morning and dinner must be ready by 7 p.m. John likes well-prepared dinners, so you'll cook something sophisticated every night. I don't want to hear any excuses." "Yes, ma'am. I'll do my best," said Mary, while mentally writing down all the requirements. Emily gave a low, dry laugh. "I hope your best is good enough. You'll have to prove your worth here. It's not easy working for me." Mary just smiled, keeping her patience. She knew Emily was testing her limits from the first moment. Her arrogance and tone of superiority were clear, but Mary wasn't going to let herself down that easily. When they had finished their tour of the house, Emily turned to Mary, now with a sharper, more direct gaze. "Oh, one more thing. I don't like employees who talk too much. Do as you're told. Keep a low profile, and everything will be fine." "Understood, ma'am. I'm not one for talking too much," said Mary, with a slight smile that hid how important it was to keep her eyes open. Emily nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. "Good. Let's see how you do. Now, you can start by cleaning the living room. I have appointments today, and I don't want to see a speck of dust when I get back." With that, Emily left the room without looking back, leaving Mary alone in the vastness of that oppressive house. As she picked up the cleaning materials and began her work, Mary took a deep breath. The first part of the plan had worked. She had successfully infiltrated and could now observe Emily up close. But as she scrubbed the floor and cleaned the furniture, Mary felt the pressure mounting. It wouldn't be easy to put up with Emily's arrogant behavior for so long without letting her true identity show. However, she knew that this was the only way to protect John from an unhappy future marriage. If she treats her employees like this, thought Mary, how will she treat my son in time? That evening, as she tidied up her belongings in the small bedroom, Mary reflected on her first meeting with Emily. Everything had gone as she had expected. The young woman was cold, distant, and clearly had no respect for those who worked for her. But the real question was, did John know this side of Emily? Or was she showing him a completely different side? "I have to go on," she said to herself in a firm tone. "I can't reveal anything yet. I have to wait for the right moment." Mary knew that Emily wouldn't make things easy. On the contrary, as the days went by, the provocations would increase, and Emily would probably test her patience to levels that even Mary, with her quiet nature, would find hard to bear. But that was the price she was willing to pay to protect John from a marriage that, in her eyes, was destined to fail. So Mary mentally prepared herself for the challenges that lay ahead. She knew that this was only the beginning. Emily's real test was yet to come, and Mary, with all her life experience, was willing to face it all, keeping her secret until the perfect moment for the truth to come out. Mary knew that the first few days would be difficult, but she hadn't expected Emily to be so cruel right from the start. From the moment she started working in the house, she realized that Emily saw her as something disposable, a tool she could use and abuse without remorse. Although Mary was prepared to deal with this kind of attitude, the cold and humiliating way she was treated always left a bitter taste. In the very first week, Emily began to make sarcastic and provocative comments. One Thursday morning, while Mary was cleaning the living room, Emily entered the room holding a cup of coffee. "Mary, see if you can manage not to make a mess while you're cleaning, please," said Emily with a wry smile. "Last time, you left marks on the floor." Mary took a deep breath and replied calmly, "I'll do my best, ma'am." Emily approached and gave Mary a superior look. "I hope your best is enough. Not everyone is suited for this kind of work, you know." Mary continued cleaning, feeling the weight of the humiliation, but not letting her emotions show. Emily's every word was an attempt to destabilize her, but Mary kept her focus. She wasn't just there as a maid. She was there to observe, to understand the true character of the young woman who was about to marry her son. On another occasion, Mary was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Emily abruptly burst in, furious. "You didn't put the silverware on the table, Mary," Emily exclaimed, her voice cutting. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll put them on right now," Mary replied, trying to remain calm. But Emily wasn't willing to forgive so easily. "How can you forget something so basic? Do I need to supervise every detail of your work? I can't understand how people like you get a job." These words were like knives to Mary, but she remained firm. "I'll correct it immediately, ma'am." "You'd better correct it," Emily snapped, before leaving the kitchen with her nose turned up. Mary, alone, took a deep breath, feeling the tears forming. She knew she had to be strong, that this was a test not only for Emily, but also for herself. She couldn't allow Emily's words to shake her. Her ultimate goal was to protect John. That same evening, over dinner, the teasing continued. John was away on a business trip. so Emily felt free to act even more cruelly. When Mary served the wine, Emily rolled her eyes and commented to the guests, not caring that Mary heard. "That's the new maid," said Emily with a tone of disdain. "She's still adjusting, but I'm very patient. Of course, it's hard to find competent people these days." The guests laughed, embarrassed, not knowing if Emily was being serious or just exaggerating. Mary, keeping her composure, continued to pour the wine without looking at Emily. She knew that this moment was crucial. Any reaction on her part could destroy the plan she had carefully put together. After the guests had left, Emily called her into the kitchen. "You need to get better, Mary. I don't have time to deal with your shortcomings. Next time there's a dinner party, I want everything to be perfect. Understand?" Mary nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I'll do my best to make it better." "I hoped so," Emily replied, leaving the kitchen without waiting for another word. That evening, while Mary collected the dishes and cleaned the kitchen, she reflected on what had just happened. It was becoming increasingly clear that Emily had no respect for anyone she considered inferior. The contempt with which she treated her employees was shocking, and Mary knew that this would not go unpunished for long. There would come a time when the truth would be revealed, and Emily would have to face the consequences of her actions. In the days that followed, the humiliations only got worse. Emily would criticize her for any detail, no matter how insignificant. If the coffee was too hot or too cold, if the flowers in the room weren't perfectly aligned, Emily would find a way to put Mary down. Her tone was always the same, condescending and sarcastic. "Mary, it's awful in here. How do you expect me to keep a decent house if you do such a mediocre job?" "I apologize, ma'am. I'll redo it." "You always apologize, but you never improve. I don't think you're capable of doing this job. Have you considered another career? Something more suitable for someone with your limited skills?" These words were hard to hear, but Mary remained steadfast. She knew she was approaching the moment when she would have enough proof of Emily's true character. Each humiliation was one more piece of the puzzle, one more piece of evidence that Emily was not the right woman for her son. Even in the most difficult moments, Mary remembered why she was there. It wasn't just a question of enduring the offenses, but of protecting John from a painful future. She knew that Emily was revealing herself more and more, and that soon there would be no doubt about who she really was. John needs to see this for himself, Mary thought as she folded the tablecloths and set the table for the next dinner. "I'm doing this for him, so that he doesn't regret it in the future." Emily's humiliations, although painful, were a small price to pay to ensure that John knew the truth before taking such an important step in his life. With each passing day, Mary felt that the moment of revelation was drawing closer. Emily was digging her own hole, and when she least expected it, her true face would be exposed to everyone. The day of a dinner party had arrived, and Emily's house was impeccably decorated. Everything had to be perfect to impress the guests, many of whom were John's friends and important business contacts. Mary, as always, was in charge of preparing the meal and serving during the event. She already knew that the evening would be a great test of her patience. From early on, Emily had been particularly demanding, inspecting every detail and finding fault where there wasn't one. While Mary set the table with the finest silverware and crystal goblets, Emily repeatedly entered the room to check. "No, no, no. The wine glasses need to be a little further away from the plates, Mary. How can you not know that?" said Emily with an irritated tone as she watched Mary setting the table. "Sorry, ma'am. I'll adjust it right now," Mary replied calmly while trying to contain her frustration. Emily snorted, visibly impatient. "It's always like this, Mary. I don't know what I'd do without myself to supervise everything. You never seem to learn." Mary remained silent, concentrating on what she was doing. She knew that this was only the beginning of a long evening. As the guests began to arrive, Mary stayed behind the scenes, preparing dinner in the kitchen and making sure everything went according to plan. She knew Emily would make a point of showing her at some point, but until then, she was focused on making sure the meal was perfect. Laughter and conversation filled the dining room as Emily circulated among the guests, distributing smiles and compliments. It was as if she was an exemplary hostess, completely different from the cold and arrogant person Mary knew. Everyone seemed charmed by Emily's kindness, and Mary, watching from afar, knew it was just a facade. Shortly afterwards, dinner was served. Mary, quiet and efficient, began to bring the dishes to the table. Each dish was meticulously prepared and laid out in front of the guests with the utmost care. However, when she went to serve Emily, the young woman took the opportunity to humiliate her. "Mary, the dish is a little too hot, don't you think?" said Emily with a fake smile. "You should be more careful. We don't want our guests to burn their hands, do we?" The guests laughed, albeit uncomfortably. Mary nodded, keeping her composure. "Of course, ma'am. I'll be more careful." Emily, pleased with the guest's reaction, continued to tease. "Mary, you should know this now. It seems that these simple details are difficult for you." Mary, controlling her frustration, only replied with a nod. The evening had only just begun, and she could already feel the weight of the humiliation to come. As dinner went on, Emily never missed an opportunity to put Mary down in front of everyone. With every dish served, every drink poured, she made a passive-aggressive comment. "Oh, Mary, why wasn't the wine poured before everyone had their plates on the table? You should know better than to do that first," Emily commented, laughing as she looked at her guests. "But well, we can't expect everyone to know these rules of etiquette." Mary, once again, just smiled politely and got on with her work. But inside, she was watching Emily's every word, every action. Her mask of perfection was beginning to slip, and the young woman's true personality was becoming more and more visible to everyone. At one point in the evening, while the guests were relaxing after dinner, Emily decided to make Mary the center of an even greater public humiliation. With everyone at the table, she stood up and called out to Mary. "Mary, come here, please," said Emily with a tone that seemed friendly, but which Mary knew was loaded with ulterior motives. Mary approached the table, waiting for Emily's orders. "I was just telling my friends how difficult it is to find good employees these days," began Emily, smiling at her guests. Mary is dedicated, but well, let's just say she's still learning. The guests laughed, some uncomfortably, but no one dared to say anything in Mary's defense. She, for her part, remained quiet, feeling the embarrassment, but not letting it visibly shake her. "You know, Mary," Emily continued, "it's important to pay attention to the details. Like the time you forgot to polish the cutlery before dinner. That was embarrassing, wasn't it?" Mary nodded slightly. "Yes, ma'am. I remember that," she replied in a calm voice, trying to hide the growing tension in her chest. Just then, the door to the room opened and John walked in. He had finished his meeting earlier and decided to surprise Emily by arriving earlier than expected. The festive atmosphere in the room seemed to have disappeared the moment he entered, his eyes quickly taking in the scene. John stood still for a moment, watching his fiancée with the guests, and then his eyes turned to Mary, who was being publicly humiliated. He didn't say anything immediately, but the tension on his face was evident. "John, what a surprise!" exclaimed Emily, running up to him with an exaggerated smile. "We were just having a bit of fun. I was telling our friends how difficult it is to find competent people to work with these days." She laughed, trying to smooth over the situation. But John didn't smile. He looked from Emily to Mary, then back to Emily, and asked calmly, "Is that how you treat the people who work for you, Emily?" The tone of his voice was firm, and everyone in the room fell silent, waiting for what would come next. Emily, still unaware of the seriousness of the situation, tried to laugh it off. "Oh, John, I'm only joking. You know I like to keep the atmosphere light," she said nervously, but her smile faltered. John looked directly at her, his expression serious. "There's nothing funny about it. You're humiliating Mary in front of everyone, and I won't tolerate that kind of behavior." Emily turned pale, her words caught in her throat. I didn't mean to. It was just a joke." She tried to justify herself, but it was too late. John turned to the guests and said, "I'm sorry, but this dinner is over for me," he said, clearly disappointed, and then turned to Mary. "Mom, let's go." John's revelation shocked everyone in the room, especially Emily, who was paralyzed, unable to react. The silence was overwhelming. The dinner party went ahead as Emily had planned, or so she thought. She was at the height of her arrogant behavior, showing false kindness to her guests while using Mary as the target of her provocations and humiliations. The room was full of laughter and conversation, but for Mary, the sound was drowned out by her own concentration on keeping calm. She knew that soon things would change, but she had no idea that it would happen that night. As Emily continued her act as perfect hostess, the front door suddenly opened. John, who was supposed to be out of town because of a business meeting, walked in unexpectedly. He was back early, something Emily hadn't expected. With his watchful eye, John observed the scene for a moment without being noticed. At the back of the room, he saw Mary being treated with contempt while Emily laughed with her guests, without the slightest regard for the maid's dignity. John couldn't believe what he was seeing. His mother, the one who had always supported him, who had faced so many difficulties raising him, was now the target of public humiliation in the home of the woman he was about to marry. The expression on his face hardened. He knew he couldn't remain silent. "John!" Emily exclaimed on seeing him. Her face lit up with false surprise. "You're early. I'm so glad you could make it." She ran up to him, trying to hug him, but John stood his ground, without returning the gesture. "Yes, I finished the meeting ahead of schedule and thought I'd surprise you," he said calmly, although his voice carried a tension that Emily didn't immediately notice. She smiled, apparently relieved by his presence. "We're all having so much fun," Emily continued, not noticing John's serious look. "We're just playing with Mary a bit. She's been a bit of a mess tonight, hasn't she, Mary?" Mary remained silent, her head down as she continued to clear the dishes on the table. She could feel the weight of the situation growing, but knew it was only a matter of time before it all came to light. John watched the scene, his eyes fixed on Emily. He knew he needed to keep control, but anger was bubbling up inside him. "Joking?" he repeated slowly. "Is that what you call treating my mother?" The whole room fell silent. The guests looked at each other, confused, while Emily, pale, froze in her place. "What? Your mother?" she stammered, trying to laugh, but her voice failed her. John stepped forward, his eyes now fixed on Emily. "Yes, Emily. Mary is my mother, and you just spent the whole evening humiliating her in front of all those guests." Emily was speechless, her eyes wide with shock. She opened her mouth to try to justify herself, but nothing came out. The reality of what had just happened hit her like a punch in the gut. She had never imagined that the woman she had despised and demeaned so many times was actually John's mother. "John, I didn't know," Emily finally managed to say, her voice shaking. "If I'd known, I never would have," but John interrupted her. "Exactly, you didn't know," he said, his tone cold and controlled. "But that doesn't matter, Emily. The fact is that you treated my mother, and anyone else you consider inferior, with cruelty and contempt. If she wasn't my mother, do you think that would make a difference? Respect is something you owe everyone, not just the people you want to impress." Emily tried to approach him, holding out her hand. "Please, John, I didn't mean it. It was just a joke. I was trying to keep the mood light. I didn't think—" "You didn't think," John said, interrupting her again, this time in a harsher voice. "That's exactly the problem. You never think about how your words or actions affect others. For you, people are disposable, and the way you treated my mother today made that clear." The guests were completely silent, many visibly uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. Some avoided looking directly at Emily, while others looked at John with empathy. The situation had changed dramatically, and what was supposed to be a festive evening had become a moment of humiliating revelation for Emily. "John, please. I can explain. I just wanted everything to be perfect for you, for us," Emily pleaded, her voice now full of despair. "I just wanted you to be proud of me." But John shook his head in disbelief. "Do you think humiliating others is something I'd be proud of? Emily, you've never understood what really matters to me, and now I see that you never will." Emily, realizing that she was losing John, tried one more time. "John, please. I love you. We can get through this. I can change, I promise." John sighed, looking at the floor for a moment before raising his eyes back to her. "No, Emily, it's not a question of changing. It's who you are, and now I see that clearly." With those words, John turned to the guests. "I'm sorry, but I think this evening is over for me. I'm not going to go on with it." He glanced briefly at Mary, who was standing quietly in the corner of the room, still processing everything that had just happened. "Mom," he said softly, holding out his hand to her. "Let's go." Mary hesitated for a moment, but knew that this was the moment she had been waiting for. She slowly took off her apron, folding it carefully before placing it on the table. Without looking at Emily, she walked over to John and took his hand, as if she was finally leaving behind all the weight of the night. As John and Mary left the room, Emily stood still, frozen in place. She knew she had lost. There was nothing she could say or do to undo what had happened. Her guests remained silent, many trying to leave discreetly without getting any more involved in the embarrassing situation. The door closed behind John and Mary, and what remained inside that luxurious house was just the echo of an evening that should have been a success for Emily, but which had turned into a nightmare. John and Mary had left the room, leaving Emily alone in the midst of the chaos she herself had created. However, the heavy silence in the room was quickly interrupted. Feeling that she was losing control of the situation, Emily ran after them, her mind struggling to find a way to repair the damage. When she caught up with them at the entrance to the house, her voice came out shaky. "John, please wait," Emily shouted, her desperate words echoing around the room. John stopped, still with his back to her, but didn't turn around. Mary, beside him, held her son's hand tightly. She knew that this was a crucial moment for both John and Emily. "What do you want now, Emily?" John finally asked, his voice firm but full of disappointment. Emily hesitantly approached, her heels making a noise that seemed to echo in the now empty room. I didn't know she was your mother, John. I swear, if I had known, I would never have treated Mary like that." Her voice was hoarse, and she seemed on the verge of tears. John slowly turned to face her. His eyes were cold, his posture implacable. "What if she hadn't been my mother? Would that have made a difference to you?" "Emily, the problem is not who Mary is to me, but how you treat people. How you think you have the right to humiliate someone just because you can. That says a lot about you." Emily was paralyzed. "But John, I thought I was doing the right thing, organizing everything for you, for our future." She tried to justify it, but her voice sounded more and more desperate. "Doing the right thing? Do you really think that humiliating and demeaning people is part of organizing something?" John asked, almost incredulous. "You were only concerned with the appearance of perfection, Emily. You don't care about what's behind it, and that's what worries me. I don't want someone by my side who values appearances more than character." Mary watched the conversation with a heavy heart. She knew how painful this situation was for John, but he needed to see for himself who Emily really was. This moment of confrontation was inevitable. Emily took another step towards John, reaching for his hand, but he pulled away, creating an invisible barrier between them. "I can change, John," she pleaded. "I will change. Just give me a chance. I love you. I just wanted everything to be perfect for both of us." Her tears began to roll, but to John, they seemed empty. "This isn't about perfection, Emily," he said, his voice finally softening, but without losing its firmness. "This is about who you are when no one is looking. You think you can change because you're afraid of losing me. But what really scares me is that you don't even understand what you've done wrong." Emily shook her head, her eyes desperately searching for some sign of understanding in John. "Please, John, I love you. Let's not give up what we have. I'm not perfect, but I'm willing to learn." She tried once more, her voice wavering between crying and pleading. John sighed deeply, and for a moment he seemed to be thinking. But when he looked at Emily again, his gaze was definitive. "Emily, I loved you. I thought you were someone I could build a life with, but today I saw something I can't ignore. I saw how you treat people, how you treat those you think are inferior, and that showed me that we're not compatible." Emily's face paled, and she grasped for any excuse to prolong the conversation. "I can treat people better, John. Give me the chance." But John shook his head. "Emily, this isn't about you learning to treat people better to please me. It's about who you really are. You would never have treated Mary with respect if you hadn't known she was my mother. And that shows me that your change would only be superficial. You'd always be acting, always worried about appearing perfect to others." Emily began to sob openly now, realizing that her words were not having the effect she had hoped for. "I can change, John, I promise. Please don't do this. Don't cancel the wedding." John looked at her for a long moment. Then his expression softened a little. "Emily, I don't want you to change for me. I want you to be who you are. And now, I see that this person is not someone with whom I can build the life I want. You need to understand that for yourself, not for me." Emily fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, but John stood firm. He knew it was the right decision, however painful. The image of Emily humiliating her mother that night wouldn't leave his mind anytime soon. "Goodbye, Emily," John said sadly. He then turned and walked out the door, still holding Mary's hand, who looked at Emily for a brief moment before following her son. Emily remained on the floor, sobbing and unable to process everything that had happened. She had never imagined that she would lose John like this, over a single dinner, due to a series of actions that she never thought would be revealed. But now, facing the reality of her own choices, she understood, even if too late, that the real fault lay not in how she treated Mary specifically, but in how she treated anyone around her who couldn't offer her something in return. As John and Mary walked away from the house, the silence was broken only by their footsteps. John was quiet, but Mary knew he was processing everything. She squeezed his hand gently, a silent gesture of support. "You did the right thing, son," said Mary, her voice soft. "I know, Mom," John replied, although the pain in his voice was clear. "I just can't believe I didn't see it before." "Sometimes we only get to see people's true character in moments of confrontation," said Mary. "And now you have, and that's the most important thing." John sighed, the weight of the evening still on his shoulders. But with his mother's support by his side, he knew that, however painful it was, he had made the right decision. And in time, he would find peace in the knowledge that he had avoided a future full of falsehood and superficiality, something he could never accept. The confrontation was over, and the truth had finally been revealed. The room was plunged into a heavy silence, as if the air had become thicker after John and Emily's confrontation. The guests, who until then had watched the evening with uncomfortable smiles, could now barely hide their shock. No one had expected the evening to take such a dramatic turn, let alone that John would reveal the truth in such an abrupt and inescapable way. John stood stiffly, his eyes fixed on Emily, who could barely process what she had just heard. The word mother echoed in her mind, and she looked at Mary, desperately trying to make sense of it all. Mary, who until then had only been a humble, silent figure in the house, now carried a completely different weight. "What?" Emily managed to stammer, her voice weak. "Your mother." The words came out with difficulty, as if they were stuck in her throat. She was paralyzed, unable to believe that she had spent weeks, months, treating the mother of the man she was going to marry with such contempt. John took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but his voice was full of restrained emotion. "Yes, Emily, Mary is my mother, and you spent all this time humiliating her, treating her like she was nothing, simply because you thought you could. You never knew, because I didn't want you to. I wanted to see how you treated people when you thought no one was looking." He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Emily's. "And now I know." The guests in the room fell silent, each of them witnessing a revelation that would completely change the course of that evening and perhaps their lives. Some looked at Emily in amazement. Others avoided her eyes, uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. But no one dared interrupt. Emily, for her part, felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Her mind whirled, desperately trying to find a way out, a justification, something that could ease the impact of John's revelation. "John, I didn't know," she repeated, almost as a whisper, despair beginning to take hold. If I'd known she was her mother, I'd never have done it." John shook his head slowly, his eyes full of disappointment. "And that's exactly what hurts me the most, Emily. You'd only care if you knew she was my mother. It's not about who she is to me, it's about who she is as a person. How do you treat people you think are worthless? How do you think you can step on others and get away with it, just because they're in a different position to you?" Emily took a step back, her legs weak. I never meant to hurt you," she stammered. her voice barely audible. It was a misunderstanding. John sighed deeply, frustration evident in every word. You humiliated my mother in public. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Emily. It was a reflection of who you are, the way you treat others, especially those you see as inferior, says everything about you. Emily looked around, the faces of the guests now seeming to judge her. She had always prided herself on keeping up appearances, on being seen as someone sophisticated and in control. But now, everything was falling apart. Her eyes turned to Mary, who remained calm, watching from afar, without any expression of revenge or satisfaction. Mary, Emily said, her voice trembling, trying to find a connection with the woman who now carried so much weight in her life. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I never meant to. Please forgive me. Tears began to roll down her cheeks as she desperately tried to repair what seemed irreparable. Mary, who had endured every humiliation in silence, just looked at Emily with a mixture of compassion and firmness. She knew that although Emily's apologies were genuine in that moment, they came from a place of fear of losing John, fear of seeing her world fall apart. Mary wasn't cruel, but she wasn't naive either. Emily, Mary said softly, her voice firm but without anger. It's not me you need to apologize to. It's yourself you need to face. I'm not hurt because I'm John's mother. I'm hurt because you think you have the right to treat any human being like that. Mary took a small step forward, her eyes fixed on Emily's. I hope you learn from this. Not for me, but for yourself. Emily stood paralyzed, Mary's words echoing in her mind. The weight of the truth had finally fallen on her, but now it was too late. John, his heart squeezing, looked at Emily one last time. He knew that this revelation had changed everything. There was no turning back. Emily, I loved you, he said, his voice full of sadness. But now I see that we're different. I can't stay with someone who doesn't understand the value of respect. Not just for me or my mother, but for anyone. Emily tried to approach him, holding out her hand. Please, John, I can change. I will change. Her voice was full of despair. John shook his head with a deep sadness in his gaze. I don't want you to change for me. I want you to change for yourselves. But I can't stay to see it. I can't marry someone who only cares about what other people think instead of what's right. He took one last look at Emily before turning to Mary. Come on, Mom. It's time to go. Mary nodded and, with the dignity she had maintained throughout the evening, followed at her son's side, leaving the room in complete silence. The guests, stunned, didn't know what to say or do. What should have been an evening of celebration had turned into a painful spectacle of revelations, and no one could turn back. Emily stood there, alone, her tears falling silently as she watched John and Mary walk out the door. She knew she had lost more than a fiancé that night. She had lost her self-respect, something that would take a long time to regain, if ever. Emily was completely paralyzed after John's revelation. Her mind was spinning in circles trying to process what had just happened. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet, leaving her lost in a void that she didn't know how to fill. Humiliation and shock consumed her, and she could hardly believe what she had heard. How was this possible? Mary, the maid she had despised for so long, was actually John's mother. She felt unable to breathe, unable to react. This can't be happening, she muttered to herself, her voice weak and almost inaudible. She tried to convince herself that it was all just a bad dream, something too surreal to be real. But the reality was there, in front of her eyes. John had gone off with his mother, leaving her behind, helpless, in the middle of what was left of what should have been a perfect night. Emily looked around, seeing the gazes of the guests fixed on her, some full of pity, others of judgment. People murmured quietly, exchanging embarrassed glances. She felt small, vulnerable, as if every pair of eyes was stripping her of whatever facade she was trying to maintain. Her facade of perfection, of control, had crumbled in a matter of minutes. I didn't know, she stammered, trying somehow to justify herself to those still watching her. I had no idea, but her words sounded empty, without conviction. The stares continued. She shrank back, as if the room had suddenly turned cold. Her mind replayed John's words, like a distant echo that became more painful each time she heard them again. He didn't want to be with someone who treated people with contempt. He had made it clear that the problem wasn't the fact that Mary was his mother, but the way Emily treated anyone she thought was inferior. "I'm not like that. I'm not that person," she whispered to herself, trying to convince herself, but deep down she knew there was no escaping the truth that John had exposed. Yes, she was like that. She had always cared more about appearances than people. And now, this truth was embedded in her, impossible to ignore. Desperate, Emily tried to gather what was left of her strength. She needed to talk to John. She needed to make him understand. He couldn't just walk away and end it all. They were engaged. They had plans of future together. It couldn't all end because of a misunderstanding. She kept repeating it in her mind, trying to believe that there was still a chance to save the relationship. She stood up hastily, her legs shaking under the weight of her humiliation. I need to talk to John," she said, as if speaking to herself, trying to convince her mind to act, to move on. "It can't end like this." With hesitant steps, Emily left the room and headed for the door where John and Mary had disappeared moments before. But as soon as she reached the entrance, she saw that they had already left. The night was silent outside, and the darkness seemed to reflect the emptiness she now felt inside. Emily stood still, staring at the empty street, not knowing what to do. "John," she shouted, but her voice echoed in the silence, unanswered. He was gone, and with him, any hope that he could repair the damage he had done. Emily collapsed on her knees, the tears finally flowing freely. Her face, once so carefully composed, was now marked by despair and regret. She knew she couldn't reverse what she had done, and it was eating her up inside. "Why did I do it?" she asked herself, her voice laced with sobs. She tried to remember every moment when she had treated Mary with contempt, every bitter word she had uttered, every arrogant gesture she had used to humiliate her. Until then, she had never given these actions much thought. They were trivial, insignificant to her. Mary was just the maid, someone who was part of the household, but who never took up space in her mind. Now, however, each of these memories tormented her, like knives piercing her conscience. "I've ruined everything," Emily whispered to herself, feeling the weight of her actions crash over her like a crushing wave. She didn't know what to do, how to move on. The only thing she knew was that she had lost John, and more than that, she had lost respect for herself. The door behind her opened, and a few guests began to leave, still avoiding looking directly at her. Emily could hear the whispers, the murmurs of surprise and judgment. She felt the blood rise to her face, a mixture of shame and anger taking hold of her. How had it all come to this? She stood up slowly, still dizzy from what had happened. "I'll fix this," she muttered to herself, trying to find one last shred of hope. "I have to fix it." But deep down, she knew that it might already be too late. John's words had been clear, definitive. He didn't want someone by his side who didn't know how to value people for who they really were. And at that moment, Emily began to realize something she had never admitted. She had built her life around appearances, and this was now taking its toll. As the guests dispersed and the house became emptier and emptier, Emily felt alone like never before. The evening was over, and with it, perhaps the future she had planned for so long. What remained now was the emptiness of her choices and a long road to finding some form of redemption, if that was even possible. The echo of John's words continued to resonate in her mind. "It's not about who Mary is to me. It's about how you treat people." The evening of fellowship had turned into a nightmare for Emily, and a sense of profound loss seemed to hang in the air as she walked back into the house. The silence, once filled with laughter and conversation, was now overwhelming. The guests had already left, and the house seemed emptier than ever. She knew the worst was yet to come. John wasn't coming back, and the end of their engagement, which she had avoided facing for so long, was now inevitable. The next day, Emily woke up with a heavy head. She had been up all night, reliving every moment of the previous night in her mind, unable to find a way out of the situation. The house was quiet, but the weight of the silence seemed deafening. She looked at the engagement ring on her finger and felt a pang of despair. Everything she had built, the perfect image of a life with John, was falling apart. During the morning, she tried to pull herself together, but she knew she had to face John. He hadn't returned home, and that was already a clear sign. Finally, when she picked up the phone to call, her heart was beating so fast she could hardly think. The phone rang, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then John's voice sounded on the other end, cold and distant. "Emily," he said without emotion, "we need to talk." She felt a shiver run down her spine. "John, can we talk? I need to explain. I'm sorry about what happened yesterday." Her voice was full of despair, but she knew that apologies wouldn't be enough. "There's nothing to explain, Emily," John replied with a tone that made it clear that his mind was already made up. "I've already understood everything I need to." Emily took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "John, please, I know I made mistakes. I shouldn't have treated your mother like that. And if I'd known who she was, I would never have done it. I swear." On the other end of the line, John was silent for a few seconds before speaking. "And that's exactly what worries me, Emily. You only care because she's my mother. If it had been anyone else, nothing would have changed, and that's a much bigger problem. It's not about what you did to her because of our relationship, but about how you see and treat anyone who to you has no value." Emily clutched the phone tightly, feeling the lump in her throat increase. "John, I can change. I will change. Give me a chance to show you." But John didn't seem willing to reconsider. "You don't understand, Emily. This isn't something that can be solved by promising to change. You showed who you really are last night, and I can't marry someone who treats people like that." Tears started streaming down Emily's face, and she tried to hold back, but the emotions were overwhelming. "Please, John, don't leave me. We can get through this. We can fix things." "No, Emily," John replied firmly, although his voice revealed sadness. "There's no fixing it. I love you, or at least I thought I did. But now, I see that what we have isn't enough to build a life together. Respect and compassion are things you should have for anyone, not just because it's convenient for you." Emily fell into a painful silence, unable to respond. His words were like stabs to her heart, but she knew he was right. She knew that her actions had led to this moment, and now there was no running away from the truth. "I'm canceling the wedding," John said, breaking the silence with his final decision. "I've already contacted the caterer and the suppliers. Everything will be sorted out. Don't worry about any of it." Emily could hardly believe what she was hearing. The wedding, the dream she had planned for so long, was now falling apart before her eyes. "John, please," she tried once more, but her voice failed her. "Goodbye, Emily," John said, his voice firm. "I hope you learned something from this, but I can't be by your side to see this change. Take care." And with that, he hung up. Emily stood there, phone still in hand, feeling the emptiness spread inside her. The end of her engagement had been confirmed, not by a heated argument or a big scandal, but by the coldness of a relationship that could no longer continue. Everything she had fought for, all the appearances she had kept up, meant nothing now. Time seemed to pass slowly after that. The days blended together as Emily wandered around the house, aimlessly. The wedding preparations were canceled, and the suppliers, one by one, got in touch, politely expressing their regrets. With each phone call, the reality became clearer. The wedding was over, and with it, the life she had imagined so much with John. The engagement ring was still on her finger, like a painful reminder of what she had lost. But deep down, Emily knew that the end of the engagement wasn't just about that fateful dinner. It was the result of an accumulation of choices she had made over time, choices that were now turning against her. However, what tormented her most was not just the loss of John, but the fact that for the first time, she was confronting who she really was. Emily had always cared about being seen as the perfect bride, the ideal partner. But now she saw that her quest for perfection had masked the lack of empathy and compassion she felt for others. The end of the engagement wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was the end of an illusion. And now Emily would have to face a new reality. A reality in which she would have to reinvent herself. Not for John, but for herself. And although this terrified her, It was perhaps the only way for her to finally find some kind of redemption. Emily's departure came as quietly as her fall. After the engagement was called off, the house that had once been full of wedding plans and preparations became an empty, gloomy place. The grandiose furniture, the decorated walls, and the rooms that had once been full of life now seemed like spaces oppressed by silence, reflecting the emptiness she felt inside. Emily knew there was no way she could stay, not just because John had broken off the engagement, but because everything around her was a reminder of the mistakes she had made, the moments of arrogance and contempt that had brought her to this point. She felt the constant presence of judgments that weren't visible, but were there, in the walls that witnessed her humiliation, in the corridors that echoed the voices of a happiness that was never genuine. On the morning of her departure, Emily got ready in silence. The dress she wore was simple, different from the elegant outfit she usually chose, but she didn't have the energy to worry about her appearance. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She felt exhausted, as if all the weight of her decisions was on her shoulders, pressing down on her to the point where she could barely breathe. As she packed her bags, the sound of zippers closing echoed through the empty house. The noise seemed to amplify the loneliness that now dominated every corner of the place. She carefully put some clothes, documents, and personal belongings into her suitcase. The things that once seemed important, jewelry, expensive dresses, and designer shoes, were now just reminders of a life that no longer made sense. She didn't want to take anything that symbolized who she had been before. As she finished packing, she looked around, staring at the details of the house she had helped to decorate. The sparkling chandelier in the dining room, the perfectly aligned cushions on the sofa, the meticulously chosen paintings. It all seemed so superficial now. Every decorative choice reflected the person Emily had worked so hard to be. Perfect on the outside, but empty on the inside. One last look around was all she took before picking up her suitcase and heading for the front door. As she opened the door, a breath of cold air hit her, as if the world outside had been waiting for this moment. The sunlight seemed strangely distant, cold, unable to warm the chill she felt in her heart. But she knew she had to move on. As she walked down the stairs to the entrance, a bitter feeling took hold of her mind. There were no emotional goodbyes, no gestures of affection, no one to see her off. Emily was alone. Her departure was as insignificant as her presence had become. The people around her had drifted away, as had John. She had built up a life of appearances, but in the end found that when the facade fell, there was no one genuinely by her side. On the way to the car, Emily felt a tightness in her chest. She knew it wasn't just the end of her engagement to John, but the end of a version of herself that had never been true. She had always cared what others thought, had always lived to meet expectations, and now she was forced to face the reality of her choices. As she looked at the engagement ring still on her finger, she hesitated. The sparkle of the diamond, which had once represented a promise of eternal love, now seemed a bitter reminder of her failure. Standing next to the car, Emily slowly took off the ring and held it for a moment, observing how the light reflected off the facets of the jewel. It was beautiful, perfect, just like the life she had planned. But at the same time, it was cold and impersonal, just like their relationship had become. Without any further hesitation, she put the ring back in the box and left it on top of the car console. She couldn't take it with her. It was no longer part of who she was. As she got into the car and started the engine, Emily felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Fear, regret, sadness, and a vague sense of relief. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay there. The car began to move slowly down the street she had driven down so many times alongside John, but now it felt different, as if it was the first time she was really driving alone. As the car moved forward, her mind relived the moments that had brought her to that point. The arrogance with which she treated Mary, the nonchalance with which she disdained others, and the moment when John confronted her. Every word he said seemed even truer now, resonating in her mind like a constant echo. "It's not about who my mother is to me, it's about how you treat people." Emily knew that this phrase, in particular, would stay with her forever. There was no undoing what she had done, but she knew she had to start somewhere. Tears streamed down her face as she drove. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. They were of acceptance. She could no longer run away from the person she had been. The road ahead was long and uncertain. But for the first time in a while, Emily felt it was time for a change. Not for John, not to regain what she had lost, but to find some sense of truth within herself. Her departure from the house wasn't just physical. It was a departure from everything she had been until then. And although the pain was deep, Emily knew that somehow she had to learn to live with her choices. The future was still uncertain, but her departure marked the beginning of a journey that she would have to face alone. After John and Mary left Emily's house that evening, the drive to Mary's was silent, with both of them processing recent events. What should have been an ordinary evening of socializing had turned into a painful revelation, and John still felt the weight of the decision he had made. He looked at the road in front of him, but his mind was far away, reliving every word, every gesture that had led to the breakdown of the engagement. Mary, beside him, watched her son, feeling the anguish he was trying to hide. When they arrived at Mary's house, the small, cozy home where John had grown up, the atmosphere was completely different from the cold opulence they had just left behind. The space, simple but full of love, had always brought John comfort. But that night, he felt as if something inside him was broken. Mary looked at him with understanding eyes, knowing that this was the moment to talk. "Son, are you all right?" Mary asked gently, breaking the silence as soon as they entered the house. John didn't answer straight away. He took off his coat, hung it on the hanger by the door, and finally turned to his mother. "I don't know, Mom," he said, his voice laden with a sadness he couldn't hide. "I know I did the right thing, but that doesn't make it any easier." Mary nodded, understanding deeply what he meant. Difficult decisions are never easy, even when we know they're the right ones. But you do what needed to be done, John. And, believe me, that's what matters. They sat at the kitchen table, a familiar place where many important conversations had taken place over the years. Mary, as always, kept her presence calm and serene, offering John the silent comfort he needed. She knew he was feeling lost, but she also knew that he would find his way eventually. "I didn't want it to be like this," John confessed, his voice low. "I really believed that Emily and I had something special. I thought she was the person I was going to spend the rest of my life with." Mary watched her son for a moment, seeing how much he was hurting. It's natural to feel that way. When we fall in love, we see the best in people and we cling to that. But sometimes, people reveal sides we weren't ready to see. She paused, choosing her words carefully. You needed to see who Emily really was. And as painful as it was better to find out now than after taking an even bigger step. John nodded, knowing that his mother was right. He looked down at his hands on the table, as if trying to make sense of everything that had happened that night. "I feel like an idiot," he admitted. "How can I not realize it before? How can I let it go this far?" Mary, with her silent wisdom, shook her head. "You're not an idiot, John. Sometimes love blinds us to certain things, and there's no shame in that. The important thing is that you saw the truth in time." She paused, watching John's tired face. "You've always been a fair and good person, and what happened today was a reflection of that. You couldn't allow someone who treated others like that to be part of your life." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just didn't expect it to end like this. I wanted to believe that she could be different, that somehow she would learn to be kinder, more empathetic." Mary smiled slightly, understanding. "People can change, John, but that change has to come from them. We can't force someone to be different. And you've done the right thing by not accepting less than you deserve. You deserve someone who treats everyone with respect, no matter who they are." The silence returned for a moment, and John felt the weight of his mother's words penetrating his heart. He knew she was right, but that didn't make it any less painful. Suddenly, he looked at her with an expression of gratitude and sadness at the same time. "Mom," John said, his voice heavy with emotion. I'm sorry for putting you through that. I didn't know you were being treated like this for so long, and it tears me up inside." Mary shook her head gently, reaching out to take John's hand. "You don't have to apologize, John. I knew what I was doing. I kept silent because I wanted you to find out the truth for yourself. And in the end, you did. That's what matters." John's eyes filled with tears, but he held them back. He had never imagined that his mother had endured so much for him. The thought of Mary, such a strong and dignified woman, being humiliated like that, filled him with sadness and anger. "I should have seen it before," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You saw when you had to," said Mary, as calmly as ever. "And now we can move on. You have a bright future ahead of you, John. And when the time is right, you'll find someone who shares the same values as you. Someone who loves you for who you are and who treats everyone around you with kindness and respect." John looked at his mother, feeling a wave of relief mixed with grief. "Thank you, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." Mary squeezed his hand affectionately. "You're my son, John. I'll always be there for you, no matter what." They sat there for a while longer, talking, laughing softly at old memories, and little by little, the tension of that night began to dissipate. John knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with his mother's support, he felt he could move on. The pain of the breakup was still there, but so was the certainty that he had made the right decision. At that moment, John realized something important. His true strength didn't come from avoiding pain, but from facing it, learning from it, and moving on, surrounded by the genuine love of those who really mattered. And with Mary by his side, he knew that whatever the future brought, he would be ready. John's fresh start wasn't immediate. After the engagement broke down, he needed time to process everything. The days following that dramatic dinner were filled with silence and reflection. Although he knew he had done the right thing by breaking up with Emily, he felt an immense emptiness. The future he had imagined, the plans they had made together, everything had disappeared. The weight of the loss, however necessary, was still with him. For the first few days, John dedicated himself to work. Sinking into the tasks and businesses he managed was a way of escaping the pain he still felt. He would spend hours in the office, analyzing reports and closing contracts. But in the evenings, when the house was silent, thoughts of Emily would return in full force. The doubts and questions always arose. Had he been fair? Could he have given her another chance? One day, while looking out of her office window, Mary visited him, as she usually did. She knew John was throwing himself into work to deal with the pain, and, as a mother, she wanted to make sure he didn't lose himself in the process. "John," Mary began, taking a seat in the armchair opposite his desk, "you don't have to hide behind work to get through this. I know you're still hurting, but you need to find something beyond that to move on." John sighed, looking away from the window and facing his mother. "I know, Mom, but work is the only thing keeping me busy now. I don't know what else to do." Mary smiled softly. "I understand, but you've always had so many passions besides business. Don't forget them. It might be time to rediscover what really makes you happy." These words stayed with John for the next few days. He knew he couldn't live the rest of his life drowning in work. There was more to him than just the entrepreneur, the businessman. There was the man who liked to connect with people, who cared about the world around him, and who was always driven by a greater purpose. He just needed to rediscover that. A few weeks later, John decided to do something different. He had always had a latent interest in social projects, in ways of giving back to the community that had helped him grow up. So he got involved in a local organization that supported young entrepreneurs. They offered mentoring and financial help to small businesses that were just starting out. It awakened something inside John, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt for a long time. "This is a way to make a difference," he told Mary enthusiastically after one of his first meetings with young entrepreneurs. "I can use my experience to help these people achieve their dreams. It makes me feel useful again." Mary smiled, proud of her son. "I knew you'd find something that really motivated you, John. It's part of who you are. You've always wanted to help others grow." As the days went by, John devoted himself more and more to this new project. Not only was he helping others realize their dreams, but he was also starting to rebuild his own life. Slowly, he realized that there was more to him than his failed relationship with Emily. He began to see the breakup as an opportunity, a chance to really start again, without the expectations he had placed on himself and others. As well as working with the entrepreneurs, John also began to spend more time with his friends and family. He reconnected with people he had put aside during the engagement, and these connections helped him realize how far he had strayed from what really mattered. These small meetings, heartfelt conversations, and moments of relaxation brought back a lightness he hadn't felt for a long time. One day, while having coffee with a longtime friend, the latter said to him, "You know, John, you look happier now than I've seen you in years." "What's changed?" John thought for a moment before answering, smiling. "I think I finally realized that I was trying to live a life that wasn't mine. Now, I'm living according to what I really believe in. That makes all the difference." His friend laughed and tapped John on the shoulder. "It's good to see you like this, man. Keep it up." This new phase in John's life didn't happen overnight, but little by little he began to feel that he was rediscovering who he really was. The weight of sadness and regret began to dissipate, giving way to a sense of freedom. John realized that although the end of his engagement to Emily had been painful, it had opened up space for something new, a future built on more solid truths and a deeper respect for himself and others. One evening, while driving home from yet another event for the Young Entrepreneurs Organization, John stopped in the middle of the road, admiring the sunset. The sky was tinged with orange and pink, and he felt a peace he hadn't experienced for a long time. It was at that moment that he realized he was finally at peace with what had happened. He no longer carried the pain of separation, nor the regret of what could have been. He had learned, grown, and most importantly, found a new path. John knew that starting over didn't mean erasing the past, but learning from it and moving on. He still didn't know what the future held, but he was ready for whatever came. And this time, he knew he was walking his own path, without hiding behind expectations or appearances. It was a new beginning, and John was ready to embrace everything life had to offer. Over time, John's fresh start took him to places and people he had never imagined. His dedication to voluntary work and his contact with young entrepreneurs brought a new dimension to his life, and he was finally at peace with who he was. But in the midst of all this, he still didn't expect to find what was really missing: a new love. It was on an ordinary afternoon, during a networking event that John had organized to help new entrepreneurs connect with potential investors, that he met her. Sarah was one of the guest speakers, the owner of a small local bakery that had become a success over time. Her story of struggle and perseverance resonated deeply with John, but it was the way she spoke about difficulties with a lightness that caught his attention. After the event, while the participants were still chatting, John went up to her, curious to get to know her better. Sarah had a smile on her face, chatting animatedly with a few people about her journey. There was something about her, an authenticity, a humility, that attracted him in a way he hadn't felt for a long time. "Hello, Sarah," he said, approaching with a shy smile. "I'm John. I love your talk. Your story is inspiring." Sarah turned to him with the same warm smile. "Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard a lot about you and the work you do around here. I think we should all dedicate ourselves more to helping others, don't you?" John nodded, feeling an immediate connection. "Yes, that's what motivates me every day, knowing that, in some way, I can contribute to other people's success. And you're the perfect example of someone who made it all happen with determination and an open heart." Sarah laughed softly, her eyes sparkling. "Well, it was a lot of struggle and a few stumbles along the way, but I guess that's part of it. You learn the most from difficulties, don't you?" The simplicity of Sarah's words struck John. She spoke with an honesty he hadn't seen for a long time, without filters, without trying to be something she wasn't. As the conversation flowed, they got closer. As the conversation flowed, they realized that they had a lot in common, not just a passion for helping others, but also a shared vision of what really mattered in life. Over the next few days, John and Sarah began to meet more often. First, it was a coffee to discuss ideas for new projects, then a walk in the park where they talked about their lives, dreams, and frustrations. Sarah was unlike anyone John had ever met. She was independent, but at the same time, her humility and kindness were evident in every gesture. One evening, as they walked together along the river, the comfortable silence between them was interrupted when John, without planning it, expressed what he was feeling. "You know, Sarah," he began, hesitating for a second, I never thought I'd feel like this again. After what I went through with my last relationship, I thought that maybe love wasn't for me. Sarah looked at him, attentive, but without pressuring him. I understand. Sometimes love disappoints us so much that we start to think it's better to be alone. But what do you think now? John took a deep breath, looking at the horizon. Now, I think maybe I was wrong, because ever since I met you, I've felt something I haven't felt before. With you, I don't feel like I need to be someone else. I can be myself, without masks, without trying to look perfect. Sarah smiled, a soft, sincere smile, and took a step closer to John. I feel the same way, John. From the beginning, you've always been genuine with me, and that's rare these days. I've been through difficult things in the past too, and I always thought that maybe love was an illusion. But now, you've made me believe it's possible again. John looked into her eyes, feeling a connection so deep that it seemed impossible to ignore. Without saying another word, he reached out to take her hand. Sarah intertwined her fingers with his, and in that moment, they both knew they were ready to move on, together. The months that followed were of a lightness that John had never experienced. Unlike what he experienced with Emily, his relationship with Sarah was marked by simplicity and truth. They shared their fears, their hopes, and their stories without worrying about keeping up appearances. Love blossomed between them naturally, without haste, without unrealistic expectations. One day, while they were sitting in the cafe where they used to meet, John looked at Sarah and said, "I never imagined I'd find someone like you. Someone who accepts me the way I am and makes me want to be a better person every day." Sarah smiled, holding his hand. "And I never imagined that I would find someone who saw the world as you do, with compassion, with the desire to make a difference. You're special, John." He smiled back, feeling his heart warmed by those words. "I think that together, we can be special. I've never been so sure of anything in my life." At that moment, John realized that, with Sarah, he had found something you would never have with Emily. True love, built on respect, trust, and mutual acceptance. There were no pretenses or games. Everything was simple, real, and deep. And for the first time, he felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The love between John and Sarah grew day by day, and alongside her, John discovered that happiness didn't lie in grand gestures or promises, but in the little moments they shared. They laughed together, made plans for the future, and, most importantly, lived the present with gratitude for what they had. Finally, John found what he had always wanted, not in someone he thought he should love, but in someone who silently showed him what love really meant. Mary had always been a woman who watched more than she talked. Throughout the months that John and Sarah were together, she quietly watched their relationship blossom. She saw the little gestures of affection, the glances exchanged between them, and the lightness with which John, her son, seemed to live alongside Sarah. It was clear that he was happier, more at ease, and that filled her with joy. Mary knew in her heart that John had found something special, but as a mother, she always waited for the right moment to share her impressions. One afternoon, John decided it was time to take Sarah to officially meet his mother. Although Mary and Sarah had already met at a few events and informal gatherings, he wanted them both to spend time together. It was important to John that his mother not only approved of their relationship, but also formed a bond with Sarah, who now meant so much to him. When they arrived at Mary's house, the atmosphere was as welcoming and familiar as ever. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the table was set with some cakes that Mary had prepared for the meeting. Sarah was a little nervous, even though she had met Mary before. She knew how much Mary's opinion meant to John, and she wanted to make a good impression. "I'm glad you could make it," Mary said as she opened the door, smiling warmly. She gave John a hug and then greeted Sarah just as warmly. "Make yourself at home, dear. I'll make us some tea." Sarah smiled, "Try to relax." "Thank you, Mary. I love the smell of your house. It's so cozy." Mary smiled and nodded, disappearing briefly into the kitchen to prepare the drinks. John, for his part, stood next to Sarah, noticing the slight nervousness she was trying to hide. He held her hand and murmured softly, "It's going to be okay. My mom loves you." Sarah laughed softly. I know, but still, I want her to see me as someone who's good for you. She already does, John assured her, squeezing her hand affectionately. Soon, Mary returned with a tray, placing the tea and cakes on the table. They sat down together and started chatting about life, work, and the little everyday things that are always part of family gatherings. The atmosphere was light, and Sarah felt more at ease as the conversation flowed naturally. Mary was an excellent listener, and Sarah noticed how much she paid attention to every detail, every word. After a while John helped collect some things from the kitchen, Sarah and Mary were left alone in the living room. The comfortable silence was broken when Mary, with a serene smile, looked directly at Sarah. "You know, Sarah," she began, her voice soft and warm, "I wanted to tell you how happy I am to see John doing so well. Ever since he started going out, I've noticed a change in him, a lightness I haven't seen for a long time." Sarah, surprised and moved, looked at Mary, feeling the words penetrate deeply. "Thank you, Mary. That means a lot to me. John is an incredible person, and I feel that together we've found something very special." Mary nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "John is indeed a good man, but what I see in you, Sarah, is something that goes beyond that. He can be himself with you, without having to hide or mold himself to please you. That's rare, and I'm very grateful that he's found someone who accepts and supports him exactly as he is." Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears, but she smiled, trying to keep her composure. "That's all I want. I love John for exactly who he is, and all I want is for him to continue being happy and true to himself." Mary reached out, gently touching Sarah's hand. "I know you two have something special. As a mother, all I ever wanted was for my son to find someone who made him happy, someone who valued him for who he really is. And I see that in you, Sarah. You have a genuine connection based on respect and true love. It gives me peace to know that he's in good hands." Sarah, now overcome with emotion, squeezed Mary's hand affectionately. "Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate how much it means. Knowing that you accept and support me is very important to me. I deeply respect you and the relationship you have with John." At that moment, John came back into the room, noticing the silent exchange between his mother and Sarah. He smiled, feeling the warmth emanating from the scene. He sat down next to Sarah and, without saying anything, he knew that something important had been consolidated there. His mother's approval, something that had always meant so much to him, was now clear. But more than that, there was a connection between Sarah and Mary that went beyond mere words. "I was just telling Sarah," Mary began, looking at John, "how happy I am to see you doing so well. She's an incredible woman, and I couldn't wish for anyone better for you." John, overcome with emotion, held Sarah's hand, feeling a deep sense of relief. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot to us." Mary smiled and got up to get more tea, but before she left, she turned to the couple with a look of affection. "I'm always here for you too. Always." John and Sarah looked at each other, smiling. They knew that, with Mary's blessing, something profound had been confirmed that day. It wasn't just a mother's approval. It was confirmation that their love was true and that, together, they had the support of those who mattered most. At that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. John's journey from a broken heart to finding true love was now complete with his mother's acceptance and support. And with Sarah by his side, he knew he was ready for the next chapter of his life, secure in the knowledge that he had found the right person to share his future with. Time passed, and John and Sarah's life settled into a quiet routine full of meaning. The house they now shared was modest, but full of life. There was no longer the ostentation of before, nor the preoccupation with appearances that had once dominated John's life. Next to Sarah, he found something much more valuable: peace, simplicity, and a deep love that grew day by day. Mornings were filled with coffee shared on the veranda, while the sun rose over the horizon, gently illuminating the garden that Sarah loved to tend. John often found himself watching her, tending to the plants, with a smile of contentment. He felt that every moment with her was precious, a constant reminder that he had made the right choice in following his heart. One day, As they were walking through the park where they always liked to stroll, John stopped abruptly. He turned to Sarah, who was distracted by the fallen leaves on the ground, and took her hands. "Have you realized how different life is now?" John asked, looking into her eyes with a calm smile. Sarah, a little surprised, smiled back. "Different in what way?" she asked curiously. John laughed softly, looking around the quiet park. "From how things used to be for me. Before, everything seemed complicated. I was always worried about what other people thought, about what I had to do to keep up appearances. But now, everything is simple. With you, I don't have to be anyone but myself." Sarah squeezed his hands affectionately, understanding what he meant. "It's because you're finally living your truth, John. That makes all the difference. We don't need grand gestures or extravagant promises to be happy. All we need is each other." John nodded, feeling deeply grateful for having found someone who understood his needs and deepest desires so well. "You're right, and I never knew that happiness could be like this. So simple, yet so complete." He paused, looking at her with a sparkle in his eyes. "Sarah, I've never felt so at peace, so at home, as I do by your side." She smiled, feeling her heart warm at his words. "Me too, John. Everything seems to fit together perfectly when we're together. Life doesn't have to be complicated when you're with the right person." Over the next few months, life continued to flow naturally. John and Sarah began to plan their future together, but without the rush or pressure he had once felt in past relationships. They knew they had found something rare and wanted to build a future based on honesty, love, and respect. One day, while they were preparing dinner together, a simple meal, but one they always enjoyed as if it were a feast, John stopped in the middle of the kitchen, watching Sarah chop the vegetables. She was distracted, laughing at something he had said a few minutes earlier, and he found himself smiling back without saying anything. It was at that moment that he knew for sure that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. "Sarah," he began, his voice calm but full of meaning. "There's something I wanted to ask you for a while." Sarah looked at him, still smiling, but curious. "What is it, John?" He put the knife aside and approached her, holding her hands lovingly. "I know that life has brought us here in ways we could never have predicted. And I know that the love we have is something that doesn't happen to everyone. I feel that with you everything makes sense, and I don't want to lose that feeling for anything." Sarah remained quiet, her heart beating faster, but her eyes fixed on John's. "So I want to ask you," John continued, smiling softly, "do you want to spend the rest of your life with me? Do you want to marry me?" For a moment, the world around them seemed to stop. Sarah looked at John, and in her eyes there was a mixture of surprise, emotion, and deep joy. She smiled, and tears began to fill her eyes. "John, of course," she replied, laughing as the tears fell softly down her cheeks. "I want to spend my life with you, more than anything." John smiled, feeling an indescribable happiness. He hugged her, and they stayed like that in the middle of the kitchen, laughing and crying at the same time, lulled by the certainty that they had found each other in the purest and truest way. The wedding was simple, just as they wanted, a small ceremony, attended only by close friends and, of course, Mary, who looked at her son with silent pride and genuine happiness. Throughout the ceremony, Mary knew that John had finally found the peace and love he had always deserved. And so, over time, John and Sarah continued to build a life together. A life full of small but meaningful moments. They laughed together, faced challenges side by side, and always found time for the things that really mattered. And above all, they kept each other as the priority in their lives. John never looked back on the past with regret. The journey he had been on, with all the difficulties and disappointments, had brought him to Sarah. And he knew that, despite the obstacles, every step had prepared him for this true love. A love that didn't demand perfection, only authenticity. With Sarah by his side, John finally understood what a happy ending meant. It wasn't the end of a story, but the beginning of a new one, where every day together was a continuation of something beautiful and genuine. John's happy ending wasn't found in grand promises or dramatic gestures, but in the small moments of love and peace he now shared with the woman of his life. If you enjoyed this video, comment your age and tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if you'd like to see more content like this, we prepared the next video just for you. Click here to watch